Welcome to this episode of Global Jewish Perspectives. I'm Phyllis Nembler-Miller, and today I have the pleasure of talking with Dan Gordon, a veteran Hollywood producer, director, writer, you name it, he's done it. And until this week, yesterday, I believe, he was a member for, I think, 56 years of the Writers Guild of America. He's going to tell you what the Writers Guild is, and then we're going to go from there. Dan, the floor is yours.
Hi, nice to be with you, Phyllis. Thank you for having me on. The Writers Guild of America is, as its name implies, basically the union of screenwriters who work both in television, film, and new media. It was started in the 1930s as the Screenwriters Guild of America, and then later it evolved with the advent of television into the Writers Guild of America. And it represents the collective interests of its membership. Its membership is a closed shop. In other words, every network, every studio that is a signatory with the WGA can only hire union writers. And if you are not a union writer and you get a gig writing for television or for motion pictures or new media, then you have to join the guild and you pay a certain amount and you get your guild card and you're part of the club.
And I would like to say, as someone who would love to be part of the club and has never qualified, it's not the kind of organization you just say, I want to be a member. You have to earn the right. So I want to put that out there for those who don't know that. So now, Dan, tell us your background and how you come to this point that we're about to discuss.
You know, I was born in Southern California. And I was raised in Southern California and in the Valley of Jezreel in Israel. I went to school both in California, and I was in Kibbutz Ginegar and went to the regional high school at Kibbutz Ifat. I came back to the United States after high school, and then after college, I went back to Israel in time to be drafted into the army for the Yom Kippur War. And I lived in Israel, married in Israel. 2 of my 3 sons were born in Israel. And then I moved back to the United States in 1980 and continued my career as a screenwriter and have done so since then. I got my guild card in 1967. I was at that time 20 years of age, and I was the youngest screenwriter in the United States. I was on the lot when there was another Jewish kid on the lot who was directing a 15-minute episode of Night Gallery. And we were the 2 youngest kids on the lot. That was Steven Spielberg, and I was the other one. And somebody said, you ought to meet this guy because, you know, you're both the same age and you're both kids and you're both doing it. And I said, well, what is he doing? They said, well, he's directing a 15-minute segment of Night Gallery. And I said, I'm a feature writer, man. So many years later, I worked with Mr. Spielberg and told him that anecdote, and evidently I found it much more amusing than he did. So
that's interesting. So now let's talk about October 7th. Hamas brutally attacks Israel. We won't even, beheading baby. It's just beyond horrific. And then what happens in terms of the Writers Guild West? And we're talking about, there's 2 branches, Writers Guild East and Writers Guild West. And we're going to be talking only about Writers Guild West. So then what happens?
Silence. Utter and complete silence. While SAG, the Screen Actors Guild, and the DGA, which is the Directors Guild, of which I'm also a member, issued very strong, forceful, immediate condemnation, which is the only logical response to the beheading of babies and dismembering of children in front of their parents and tying families together and burning them alive. There is no other response than condemnation. The Writers Guild remains silent. This is a guild that does not have a habit of being quiet. It's a very loud guild. It knows how to be loud when it declares a strike and declares itself the victim of the studio's avarice. It knows how to take stances when George Floyd is murdered. It knows how to take stances in the Me Too movement. But when it comes to the atrocities committed against Jews, somehow it could not find the words. Interesting when a writer can't find words. So the silence continued. And then there was a letter of support for Israel by some 300 celebrities, and most of them Jewish celebrities, some not. Seinfeld, Amy Schumer, Gal Gadot, and it was a good statement and a strong statement. Writers Guild, silent. And then there was a statement of writers who urged the Guild to take a stance, and the Writers Guild, silent. Then there was a phone conversation, Zoom conversation of some 70 of the top writers, or perceived top writers, I don't know. Mainly television writers, I believe, who were showrunners and guys who work series, and women who work series. And they expressed their concern, and they expressed their concern to the Guild membership. And silence. And after 2 weeks of silence, in which not only was there silence from the Guild, but there began to be a shift in the narrative away from the brutality of the Hamas. And there isn't a word, I'm a writer, and there is no word in the English language to describe what took place. Pogrom does not encompass it.
No.
Massacre doesn't encompass it. Tragedy certainly doesn't encompass it. There simply is no word that I know of that encompasses what took place. To give you an example, one of the great massacres in Jewish history that was regarded as a turning point really in Jewish history that occurred at the turn of the last century was the Kishinev massacre in what was then Tsarist Russia. 97 people were killed in the Kishinev massacre. That's chump change compared to what happened on October 7th, where 1,400, now closer to 1,500 people were slaughtered. So the silence spoke volumes. The silence was not silent silence. It was very loud silence. It spoke volumes.
Out of WGA.
And then there were reports, not a statement, but reports that were obviously leaked to the press by, I believe, someone in the leadership of the Guild. I'm not sure if it was I think it was the president of the Guild. I'm not 100% sure. That it wasn't that there was no concern and they didn't care. It was that the board failed to reach consensus. I'm sorry, you can't reach consensus on condemning the beheading of babies? You can't find a consensus on that? You can't get any group of human beings in a room, show them the images that we've all seen, talk about the images which we still haven't seen, and not find a consensus worthy of condemning that? Mind you, you can make two statements at once. You can actually hold two thoughts. An intelligent person, which supposedly writers are, is actually capable of holding two thoughts at one. One is the unconditional condemnation of the terrorist group known as Hamas for its atrocities, and the other is concern for innocent Palestinians who were caught in the crossfire between Hamas, which holds them hostage.
Yes, very important.
And Israel, which is defending itself. One can certainly do that, and yet not even that was done. The revulsion I felt at being a member of an organization, and there is a great word in the English language, it is pusillanimous. That is so pusillanimous.
Could you give us a definition?
Cowardly.
Oh, thank you.
Lacking in courage, timid, cowardly, morally cowardly. My revulsion at being a fellow traveler with that organization was so great that A, I no longer wanted to be a part of it. B, I felt that I needed to resign from that organization in the most public possible fashion, to make a statement of not just protest, but revulsion at the moral bankruptcy of people who could not bring themselves to condemn the mass murder, the greatest mass murder of Jews since the Holocaust, in the face of an ideology that's no less fanatical and in its intent to commit genocide.
I think we could tell our,
that is the Hamas Charter.
right. That's what I was going to say. Let's tell our audience that what the Hamas Charter says.
Yeah, who for anyone who has not read the Hamas Covenant, I recommend it to you. And the most pertinent clause of its charter is, and I'll pretty well quote it from memory, the day of judgment will not come until Muslims fight Jews and kill them, and the Jews will hide behind rocks and trees until the rocks and trees cry out, O Muslim, O servant of Allah, there is a Jew hiding behind me, come and kill him. What about that ideology requires nuance? What about that ideology is unclear? And more so, when you see the footage of those poor kids who were caught in a music festival celebrating peace, quite literally hiding behind rocks and trees from those Islamist fanatics who wanted to murder, rape, and dismember and kidnap them. It's not that this is an allegorical or metaphorical goal. It was their goal and they accomplished it. And yet you could not find the moral clarity to condemn that. So then I penned a letter. I got an attorney, because when you resign from the Writers Guild, you have to do it following a certain legal formula.
I didn't know that.
And you become what's called a financial core member. You've basically resigned from the union, but in order to work in this town, because the town is a union shop, you then commit to pay your portion of the dues, which are solely for the operating functions of the union, to the union. So you're not a member anymore, but you're still giving them a portion of your dues so you can continue to work in this industry, because it's a closed shop industry. So I wrote the letter that I wrote, and I asked my attorney to contact those people in the press with whom he had contacts, and he did. And the letter was emailed to the Guild yesterday morning.
October 24th, is that correct?
And about an hour or an hour and a half later, the Guild released yet another, or actually its first official statement, which was again so woefully lacking in any moral backbone. And then I was asked by members of the press who had contacted me before the statement, now that the statement came out, was I mollified, and did I want to retract what I had said, and did I intend to beg the Guild for forgiveness and ask them to take me back into their fold? And the answer was, have you read what they wrote? No. They said they were, once again, they refused to condemn Hamas in any fashion. They refused to call for the immediate and unconditional release of the hostages. And they said they were appalled by what they had seen. Well, gosh, oh golly gee. And yes, let's pray for, the welfare of the Palestinian people caught in the crossfire. And our job is, we're a labor union, and we don't speak out on such issues. Well, that's BS. And I have nothing but contempt for the leadership of the Writers Guild. Nothing but contempt for them. Nothing but contempt for the so-called progressives who believe that you have to put the slaughter of babies into a context. There is no context which can justify the beheading of babies, the gouging out of eyes of old people who were tied up, the cutting off of women's breasts. I apologize for being this graphic, but I think it's important.
Yes,
The tying together of family members with wire and then burning them alive, the putting of two parents on one side of the room and their children on the other side of the room, tying them up and then setting them both on fire so the parents can watch their children, their children burn to death, and the children can watch their parents burn to death while you set up a table in the middle of the room and eat. There is no context that you can possibly imagine which can come close to nuancing that act of barbarity. So the contempt I feel for the Guild knows no bounds.
I'd like to add one thing here. This is not idle speculation of what happened. The terrorists many of them wore body cams. It's actual footage that's been seen. I just would like to emphasize this. Okay, go on. But I want people to understand this is not a question. Oh, maybe it didn't happen. This happened.
And it's not an urban legend. We now have the forensic scientists who've been trying to identify close to 200 bodies, which cannot yet be identified because the remains are so badly mutilated or charred. And I remember the testimony of one of the chief pathologists who said we did a CT scan of this charred thing, and we didn't know if it was a person or two people. We didn't know what it was. And then on the CT scan, we saw two spinal cords, one of an adult and one of a child. And then we saw this black line that went around them, and we couldn't figure out what was the line that went around them. Then we realized it was the wire that tied them one to the other when they were set on fire. A mother and child tied together by wire and then burned alive.
I saw that same news coverage.
What is there to debate? What is there to discuss? Who could possibly find a context into which one can place that act of horrible barbarity and somehow modify it to say, well, yeah, but. There is no yeah, but.
So tell us why. Tell the audience why. Why? I get very upset thinking about it too. Why do this? And just to clarify about the Writers Guild West, there is a board. When we're talking about the leadership, we are talking about the board that has, 20 members? I'm not sure. I didn't look at them yesterday. And I want to remind everyone, today is October 25th, the day after Dan sent his letter. How do you explain this absolute horrible insistence on saying nothing?
I think that what the president of the Guild said originally was true, that they had members of the board, and I don't know if it was a majority or a minority or an equal amount, and I don't really care, with whom they could not find, quote unquote, a consensus on any language to use to condemn Hamas. Correct until this day, they still haven't condemned Hamas. They still have not.
I know. That's why we're having this interview.
To say I was appalled by it is not condemning it. I'm sorry. It's talking about your feelings. And I think that's emblematic of the makeup of those folk, where it's all about them and their feelings and their safe space and their notion of who the oppressor and who the oppressed truly is or is not. And they're the same crowd that says 9/11 is what the Americans deserved. We got it because our chickens came home to roost. It's the same ideology that has blamed and excused Jew hatred and Jew genocide for roughly 2,000 years, and Islamist Jew genocide for the last 700 years. What's interesting is that the point at which the far left and the far right always meet is Jew hatred.
Yes. Yes.
There is almost an Einstein-like bending of the light. If you shoot out a beam of light into the ethos of the far left, it will eventually bend. And if you shoot out a beam of light of the far right into the ethos, it will eventually end. And those two beams of light will meet at one specific point. It's Jew hatred.
Before we end, I would like to just get one point across for people who listen to this. In 2005, Israel gave the Gaza Strip to the Palestinians. Ironically, my husband and I were on a mission. We were at Sderot, and we watched the young Israeli soldiers coming to bring all the settlers out of Gaza. So what people forget is the Palestinians have had Gaza as their own country, I guess is the right word, since 2005. And then the Palestinian people elected Hamas as their government. So while we can talk about the Palestinian people separately from Hamas, Hamas is the official government of the Gaza Strip, as well as being a terrorist organization that is recognized as such by the United States and many other countries. So when people are having these protests across the United States saying free Palestine, meaning Gaza, Gaza has been free since 2005, except it hasn't been free from the terror of Hamas.
Yes, and for those same people who say, well, yes, it can't be called free because Israel's had a blockade. Israel doesn't have a blockade. Israel has the same kind of quarantine that the United States imposed on Cuba for the exact same reason. The United States was worried about missiles coming from Cuba to hit the United States. Israel's not worried about missiles. Israel has experienced tens of thousands of missiles and suicide bombers that killed over 1,000 Israelis. And I just want to remind your viewers of one story. And everything that you said is true. Those saying free Palestine, there has been a free Palestinian state since 2005. How's it working out for you? How's it look? It is Hamasistan. But in 2005, something else happened. There was and you can look it up, there was a young woman named Wafa al-Bas. And Wafa al-Bas was a young Palestinian woman living in Gaza. She was around 20 years old. And a propane stove in her family's home blew up, and she was terribly burned. She had third-degree burns, and there was no hospital in Gaza that was able to deal with the severity of her burns. And so Israel, as it does literally with tens of thousands of Gazans, including Ismail Haniyeh's niece, who was receiving medical, Ismail Haniyeh is the head of Hamas, and his niece was receiving medical treatment in Israel for over 3 months. This young woman asked to come to an Israeli hospital. She was allowed to come to the Israeli hospital. She was treated there for months. She was treated by doctors who cared for her as if she was their own daughter. And that's not hyperbole. The people who were in the hospital with her, Arabs as well as Jews, attested to that fact. When she was finally able to go home, she went back to Gaza. She was to make return visits to check her skin grafts and her burns. When she went back to Gaza, she volunteered to become a suicide bomber for Hamas. She put on a 22-pound suicide bomb strapped to her leg underneath her jalabia. The army had a tip-off that there was a female suicide bomber about to cross, I believe it was the Erez crossing. So they said, disrobe. And you know, when the Israelis do that, all the men in the room, there are cameras on the crossing, all the men in the room are ordered out. I've been in that crossing. I have been, as an officer in the Israeli Defense Forces, ordered out by the woman officer who was there, who said, we have to check a Palestinian suspect right now. You will not be in this room. No man
Let's
will.
emphasize that the Israelis are being considered the modesty requirements, that this is really, okay, I wanted to emphasize.
And so she began to disrobe. They then saw the suicide bomb strapped to her leg. When she was discovered, she tried to detonate it several times. You can see the footage. Google it on YouTube, Wafa al-Abbas, and you'll see the footage. She began crying and screaming that she was unable to detonate the bomb. She was headed back to the hospital that had saved her life to blow up the doctors and nurses who had cared for her and the other Jewish patients who were in there for burns. She cried crocodile tears about how sorry she was and she wanted to live now, and she realized the error of her ways. She was sentenced to 12 years in prison. She was freed as part of the 1,000 prisoners who were given in exchange for Gilad Shalit. When she got back to Gaza, she began going to grammar schools, encouraging the young girls to follow her path as a suicide bomber and expressing her desire to once again be able to put on her suicide vest and become a martyr. That is the mindset of Hamas. There is no nuance to that mindset.
Exactly. As you know, Hamas has publicly said that Jews love life and they love death. They've made it very clear.
Absolutely. I'll just, in closing, I was at one time in my military service, I served in the military spokesperson unit, and I was in the military spokesperson unit in the Second Lebanon War, and then in Operation Cast Lead in 2008-9, Operation Pillar of Defense in 2012, and Operation Protective Edge in 2014. So I did that for a long time. And my opposite number, who is still there, was the spokesperson for Hamas, whose name is Abu Obeida. And a reporter, a print reporter from a magazine who I know, told me, he said, I went into Gaza and I interviewed Abu Obeida, and I asked him, what is the difference between Hamas and ISIS? And Abu Obeida was very offended by that question. He said, how can you possibly compare Hamas to ISIS? ISIS murders civilians. And the reporter said, well, I'm sorry, isn't that what Hamas does as well? And Abu Obeida bristled and he said, no, we never kill civilians. We only kill Jews.
Wow. With those chilling words, we are going to end, although I am going to say as I close, besides thanking Dan very much for coming on the show, that we hope that in the next few days, the Writers Guild will find there's a word in Yiddish, I'm not going to say it, find its whatever, to have the courage to speak up against Hamas's atrocities against Israeli civilians, Jews and non-Jews who were murdered. Let's not forget all the non-Jews who were also murdered in Israel, and to ask that all hostages be unconditionally released. Thank you.